Jim Henson is about to make a call he's been putting off for 5 years. When Henson created the Muppets, his driving motivation was to do work that could sustain itself and his own creative ambitions. Now, after 20 years of raising the Muppets to global fame, Jim was electing a new company to foster them.
We've come to be rich and famous.
But what leads an artist to sell out to a corporation? Jim conceding to corporate comfort began with a deliberate effort to escape it.
Certainly not a career that one would plan. You wouldn't decide to become a puppeteer, I don't think.
I don't recall ever seeing a puppet show when I was a kid. And I never played with puppets. I never had any to play with.
I was interested in television and films and art.
I just heard about a television station that was looking for a puppeteer.
A local TV station was recruiting young puppeteers for a new show. Jim gave himself a crash course in designing, crafting, and acting with puppets.
And so I made puppets and auditioned because I really wanted to work in television. I got a job, and they put me on, and I had a show for a little while.
From the local program to variety show appearances, and even after 5 seasons of running his very own award-winning show, Jim wasn't certain he'd be a puppeteer forever. He was an artist first and foremost. He wanted to give up the TV puppet shows to go paint, live the American in Paris lifestyle, the allure of a real artist, not a children's entertainer.
Decided to go away and paint for a year. So I went to Europe and I wandered around and I met a lot of other puppeteers.
He couldn't help but get drawn into the elevated culture of puppeteering in Europe. It was an integral form of art there, enough to convince Jim of the artistic validity of puppetry.
It was a good art form, and people were doing interesting things, and it was something that you could get into and develop and turn into something else.
From then on, he'd only question his career choice one last time, but that'd still be decades away.
I express myself through puppets just as in another time I might have expressed myself through painting or through sculpture.
Upon returning to America, Jim was determined to share and innovate the art of puppetry. Pursuing art, especially with the intent to innovate, requires resources, money.
Help!
Despite having had a successful show already, making the rounds and featuring on other programs, Jim's business wasn't yet self-sustaining and networks weren't quite ready to give him a full show. At this stage, Jim was able to fund his projects by essentially working a second job producing commercials.
He always knew from the very beginning that commerce and art were a symbiotic duo, that he had to make the money in commercials to do the stuff he wanted to do.
We have now created a delicious, tasty freeze sundae, and here it is. Yeah. And there it goes.
These commercials funded projects and pilots which amounted to not much more than good practice, but they did notably get him noticed by the team at Joan Gans Cooney's Children's Television Workshop, who at the time were hoping to use puppets in a new project.
In my proposal, I had said, let's use puppets. They felt so strongly about Jim Henson that they said, if we can't get Jim Henson, we will not use puppets at all.
What they wanted to do was to take and use some of the techniques that had been created for commercials and for television and apply them to the preschool kid.
Why don't you call your show Sesame Street? Like Open Sesame, it kind of gives the idea of a street where neat stuff happens.
Sesame Street was an instant success. Audiences adored it, and Jim's Muppet and animation contributions played a major role in that success.
I love you.
I love you too.
Thanks.
Kermit, why, you're a genius. Mwah! Yuck.
Only, there was one problem. CTW was a non-profit. Sesame Street is a publicly funded program and relied on big donors for initial seeding. Such foundations weren't keen on bankrolling programs long-term, and the show would need its own stable source of income to survive. There was an obvious solution. Exploited by all other entertainment, especially those targeting kids, merchandise. Toy merchandising. But being an education first show, the CTW was determined that any merchandising must inspire learning. Records and workbooks did okay, but the lucrative toy money was being stalled by Henson himself. Jim's greatest business practice was never relinquishing control of his characters, not in his initial rise, not in the commercials, and not even to Sesame Street. Jim hated the idea of selling out. He felt selling toys to the kids they were hoping to educate to be morally strange. It needed to be done for the right reasons. Jim's trusted agent, Hollywood legend Bernie Brillstein, seemed to have 3 of the right reasons to merchandise. 1. Kids deserve high-quality toys of the characters they love, not the knockoffs they'll seek out from shady suppliers anyway. This point was compelling, not nearly enough. 2. You'll have full control. Final say, full veto power, kill anything unfit to sell, and assure it's offered at a reasonable price. This certainly helped the case, but no, only something life-changing would change Jim's mind. 3. Artistic freedom. Those 2 words sold him. He could make enough money to have artistic freedom for the rest of his life. Henson would sell out, but the profits would fund 20 years of art, employ hundreds of artists, and inspire the world.
The productions that we do are expensive. The people that we work with have to be well paid, and so that's all part of the money that makes it all go. Might be nice if that were not the case, but we're part of the real world here.
He may have found the right reason to sell out, but the backwards reality of freeing yourself from business by entering into business of your own is having to now manage that business. Committing to making toys was only the first step. Then began the difficult process of getting around the icky, exploitative nature of purely profit-incentivized merchandising. Jim wanted to assure that the customer, the kids, would get more value from the toy than their family spent on obtaining it. The records and books tried by CTW already weren't up to Jim's standards. His greatest insight into educational merchandising was believing that if art works, then toys should just be more art. Vehicles to explore creativity, to express yourself and have fun. However, designing and producing toys that met such lofty standards would require meaningful time invested. Rather than license the toy making to an established producer like Fisher-Price, Henson adopted all design responsibilities in-house. He'd fully utilize the full veto control he was promised and create products which exceeded the expectations of any customer. The toys were another massive success. By 1990, the Sesame Street merchandising brought in $15 million per year, split between Jim Henson and the CTW. This was only the beginning of Henson's career. Off the success of Sesame Street, Henson found a home for The Muppet Show in London, running for 5 seasons and further syndication globally.
Such an extraordinary, phenomenal success. We made 120 episodes.
In the midst of the show came the movies.
You've got a deal for 2 Muppet movies.
Prepare the standard rich and famous contract for Kermit the Frog and Company.
Jim always believed that you could do more with the Muppets than other people thought you could. Nothing was impossible. Nothing.
Henson, in collaboration with great puppeteers and writers like Frank Oz and Jerry Jewell, pioneered a never-before-seen form of media, and they couldn't seem to lose.
There was a feeling in the team that we were doing something special.
He'd used the resources and trust earned from the success of all Muppet properties to create a fantasy film inspired by the illustrations of Brian Froud called The Dark Crystal.
Part of the desire was to create a whole new world, to start all over and design everything.
This incredibly ambitious project required innovations in filmmaking, visual effects, puppetry, and animatronics to pull off.
Award-winning film.
But a movie unlike any other ever made.
And of all projects that I've ever worked on, it's the one that I'm the most proud of.
Not feeling ambitious enough, still, Jim declared he'd make a show to solve world peace. Thus spawned Fraggle Rock.
Down at Fraggle Rock.
Another unsurprising success for Henson, also running for 5 seasons, globally syndicated.
And we wanted to design a show specifically to work internationally, a show that could work all around the world.
So you can see how much alike you all are.
All of this, from the start of Sesame Street to the end of Fraggle Rock, transpired over the course of just 20 years. 2 decades of landmark success, medium-defining innovations, and a lot of puppets. And then Jim made Labyrinth. Jim had always been afflicted by an insatiable interest in innovative technologies to create novel visuals. This affliction helped keep him relevant and at the pinnacle of his craft, but increasingly lapsed and stifled the storytelling itself. Becoming an overt issue with The Dark Crystal, Labyrinth had clearly taken it too far. For the first time, a Jim Henson project wasn't adored by fans, touted by critics, or both. Instead, neither seemed to engage with it.
Labyrinth was not a commercial success. That was quite a blow to him.
It was Jim's next project that would prove this worrying trend inexcusable. Jim's ventures had expanded considerably since The Muppet Show. While he was a good businessman and a great creative visionary, he could be a mediocre manager.
I tend to avoid confrontation, and I tend to push and see only the good aspects of a particular thing.
While the sense of collegiality he inspired was beneficial in producing shows and movies, it left holes in the chain of command, resulting in a loop of decision makers that would perpetually pass off responsibility. It wasn't efficient business and would inevitably manifest in the work. In 1987, Jim devised an anthology show called The Jim Henson Hour, an hour-long series that would contain 4 different theme shows telling different stories with a combination of people and puppets. The show would go through several iterations during its conception, but was sold to be a sort of best of everything show. No one seemed exactly certain what the program was meant to be, even after it came out, and it showed. Critics and audiences alike felt the Jim Henson Hour was a disaster. Of course, it had redeeming qualities and well-received segments like The Storyteller, but as revealed by Frank Oz, the Jim Henson Hour just didn't have the usual Jim focus. It was more like a grab bag of brilliant things he's done. Jim's ambitions were again getting the better of him. The Jim Henson Hour had many innovations, cutting-edge visual effects and puppets, but none in unity. He simply didn't have enough time to thoroughly flesh out ideas and manage his team, all while organizing the business. Running the company was slowly sapping his creative energy. For the first time since traveling to Europe, Jim wanted to take a step back from it all. Brian Henson, Jim's son and close collaborator, recalled this time in his father's life.
It was the first time I ever saw him not want to work, was during that period. There was a few months there that he didn't want to work. He wanted to travel and stop and think.
In a letter to his staff, Jim candidly admits,
I know this period of time has been somewhat filled with a sense of uncertainty and an apparent lack of direction, but I want to say that we are working and looking at various alternatives, and we should have a resolution in the not too distant future.
He later continued in an interview, assuring that the new transition
releases me from a lot of business problems. As anyone in the business knows, you spend a great deal of your time raising, financing, finding distributors. In theory, I'll be able to spend a lot more of my time on the creative side of things.
The resolution was to sell the Muppets. Jim had been relying on trusted partners his entire career. Joan Gans Cooney, Frank Oz, Bernie Brillstein, Jerry Jewell. The list is long and saturated with unquestionably talented individuals. The decision to sell to a company was simply the decision to trust a pre-packaged organization of talented people. During the 1970s, Jim relied on ABC president Michael Eisner to get Muppet specials aired. In 1984, Eisner became the CEO of a different company, the Walt Disney Company. Jim had offers from other major studios to buy his company outright, but for Jim, it was Disney or no one. Not only would Henson Associates benefit from Disney's financing, distribution, and marketing logistics, but wholly unique to the Walt Disney Company was its parks. Jim loved the idea of his characters having a new life in the parks. In fact, the life and longevity of his characters meant a lot to the Disney deal. Disney had not only shown their ability to preserve and promote Walt's original characters, but were also caring for the Winnie the Pooh characters by A.A. Milne, and now they'd foster the Muppets. Of course, any business deal of this caliber must be mutually beneficial. Michael Eisner had ushered in a new era of Disney administration after a long period of decline and turmoil for the company. But they were still short a creative leader, someone with vision, someone to rejuvenate the artistic vitality of the company without Walt. Getting Jim alone would have been worth it to Disney. Getting the Muppets was a bonus. This new Disney administration, however, was successful because of their scrupulous, cutthroat dealings. No detail would prove too minute, and Jim's staff and creations were treated as commodities. The Disney deal would be drawn out, unfriendly, and ultimately didn't go through after the sudden and unexpected death of Jim Henson in 1990. He was 53 years old. What Jim had accomplished, unquestionably, was establishing a timeless legacy, not only later secured by the infallible machinations of Disney, but the unwavering dedication of his Muppet colleagues, who without nothing would have been possible.
It's a kind of immortality, is that what he instilled in his colleagues, his co-workers, the puppeteers, the team, his own children, was what he gave them basically doesn't die.
Keep his characters alive.
If the audience wants these characters to continue to live, they will.
Muppets have a life of perpetuity.
Regardless of the outcome, it was Jim's decision, informed by a lifetime of experience as one of the greatest businessmen, entertainers, artists to ever live.